Welcome to Global Ideas, an initiative by Hong Kong Baptist University to bring some of the finest minds together who will help us understand some of the complex challenges of our times. I'm Anilesh Kumar. Today, we have two very special guests, starting with Mr. Einar Tanger, who is an internationally recognized political and economic affairs commentator and a regular participant in media debates and discussions, ranging from the mainstream Western media to Al Jazeera to Chinese and Indian news channels. Mr. Tanger has worked in law, politics, and investment banking, and has advised the US, South Korea, and the Chinese governments on various issues. You might have seen him robustly defending their respective positions, especially on mainstream Western media forums. So we are very privileged to have him with us today to share his views on the new Cold War. So all the way from Beijing, Mr. Einar Tanger, welcome to Global Ideas.
Thank you.
We also have Professor Daya Thussu with us. Professor Thussu is a renowned global scholar of international communication. He's known for his extensive publications in the field of global media and communication all over the world. He's the founder and managing editor of the Sage journal called Global Media and Communication. He has authored or edited 16 books and still counting. He has been a distinguished visiting professor and inaugural Disney chair in global media at Tsinghua University, Beijing, and he's currently teaching at the Hong Kong Baptist University, but thanks to COVID, he's stuck in Egypt. So all the way from Egypt, Professor Daya Thussu, welcome to Global Ideas.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we'll start with our guest, Mr. Tanger from Beijing. But before that, a quick, I would say, housekeeping appeal to all the people watching online. Please share this video as much as you can and support us. Remember, there can't be a better world without better ideas. So today we are going to discuss the new Cold War, US-China conflict, the tech war, 5G, China-India relations, the situation in Afghanistan, the influence of governance systems in a post-COVID world, and the role of media and communications. The most important thing, because I'm a student of communications, I'm very interested in that, the role of media and communication. So Mr. Tanger, my first question to you is very simple. We're having a conference on the new Cold War. Do you think there is a Cold War already there? There is this new Cold War already there, or do you think it is going to happen sometime soon? Or do you think it is just the academics trying to read too much between the lines? Mr. Tanger.
Well, before we talk about a Cold War and where it is actually happening, we should really talk about what's led to this kind of confrontation. And that is, geopolitically, you have the U.S., who has been on, a monopolar power for quite some time, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And you have a fast rising China. I mean, you'll hear a lot about the Euclides trap and et cetera. But, right now, from the Chinese perspective, it's all about, trying to take care of their economy, continue the 40-year streak of successes in their mind, and fend off what they see as a dominant power, the US. From the US's perspective, it's about American exceptionalism. I mean, after World War II and World War I, there was a strong feeling in the US that unless the US actively participated in the world and promoted democratic capitalist values, that there would be a return to a third world war, which was, of course, unthinkable. And that has kind of morphed into this situation where the US feels that it needs to maintain control, and China, because it has a different system, and the success of that system has become kind of an existential threat. So that's where I see things in the beginning. In terms of the actual Cold War, that's being perpetuated along lines, especially economic and now financial. I mean, technologically, it all relates to economics, but it's finance and technology in particular. You're not going to see a Cold War over shoes or textiles or washing machines, all things made in China going to the US. But you will see, and we are already seeing, attacks on ZTE, Huawei, many of the leading tech companies of China They have been literally blacklisted. They cannot sell their goods in the United States. If they want to do any business, they have to get a special permission from the State Department. And then on the financial side, you're starting to see Chinese companies delisted. In terms of intellectual issues, students, 500 students who had applied in STEM areas, in the graduate and postgraduate area from China to the US, have been denied visas. There's a lot of talk, bipartisan in the Congress about how they don't like China, how China's a cheater and all these things. But I think it all goes really back to this kind of existential threat that China represents to the US view of the need of its hegemony.
All right, so yes, so many things to discuss, but thanks for that opening. Professor Thussu, like you have also been teaching on international communication, global media. I have a quick question to Mr. Tanger, and then probably you can take it from there. Another question, Mr. Tanger, is about, because you have been appearing on various international media platforms, global media platforms. So when you hear this phrase global media, and Professor Thussu has been teaching about global media for, I think, more than 3 decades, so I'll ask him that as well, but I'll ask you first. Mr. Tanger, when you hear the phrase global media, what comes to your mind? What is global media for you?
Well, global media can be parsed into a couple of things. First off, the way I understand global media is there's the media as it exists in developed countries, where it is literally the fourth estate. It is absolutely necessary to a democratic country to have a somewhat impartial party looking over the pros and cons of whoever is in power, making sure that they do not use their power excessively or illegally, basically uncovering, quote, the truth. That is not the same role that you have in a country like China. The media there is to report what is going on, to bring out issues that the government is trying to promote. And this, unfortunately, this is another cultural difference. Western media looks at any media that is different from itself as somehow not valid. And so it should be, in essence, they say, look, that's not real media, that's just propaganda. Now, if you talk to somebody at CGTN or CRI or Xinhua or things like that, they believe they're doing media. Sometimes they feel a little bit constrained, but they see their roles somewhat differently than their cousins in the quote global media or Western dominated media. So when you start talking about it, first you have to come at it. Where are these two different camps coming from? Why is there such hostility towards the Chinese state, and also contempt for Chinese media? Because when I talk to almost anybody, I'm there, they just say, "Oh, Einar, you're just this is just propaganda, and you're participating in this by appearing on these different stations and things like that." So it becomes almost a personal issue, and I don't think that's really the way to do it. I really ascribe to the idea of game theory, that how you define the situation and how you define the people in it is going to have a tremendous effect on the outcome.
All right, and the Western media versus non-Western media, and whether the non-Western media is doing more propaganda than the Western media is always a debate. It will always be a debate. But Professor Thussu, you have written a book, you have been teaching this subject for almost 30 years. For people like us, student of media and communication, how do you see this phrase global media? How do we make sense of this phrase? Is there any definition, Professor Thussu?
I don't have an academic definition to share, but it's the we talk about, you mentioned Western media and non-Western media. These are quite broad categories. So if you think of an international news outfit like Deutsche Welle, for example, which is global, but actually its influence and its reach is global, but its influence is relatively limited. CGTN has actually more, language editions than many other international broadcasters. But is it a global media? So I think when we talk about global, I think we need to kind of problematize it a bit. And within the so-called dominant media, there is actually a core, and that's an Anglo-American media, that's an English language media. No wonder the Germans, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, the French, where English is not their main language, have English language channels to speak to the world, right? So that shows how important English language media are. And there's a whole, you know, I mean, there are a number of reasons, historical, cultural, the way Einar was talking about the nature of journalism itself, which is, people have argued journalism is an Anglo-American invention, although the Germans will contest that because the oldest daily newspaper was in Germany, not in English language, in German, and not in English language. So I think it's a when we talk about this very broad categories, and I am partly to blame because we, in academic writing, sometimes we put this all in one kind of, cluster, Western, non-Western, etc. I think we need to differentiate it, and this core. And if you look across the media sectors, look at financial news, look at network television, look at even online news. Just speaking about news for the moment, there is a very clear and quite, dominant tradition of English language media, largely American. And so if you think of a newspaper like the New York Times, which now has a circulation figure, something in the range of 7 million. Now that gives that newspaper extraordinary power to shape the conversation, including about new Cold War, as Einar was saying. And actually, I just have, if I may, just a little, not so much about media, but a question about the Cold War itself, because there is this, and I might address that to Einar if he has the, if he wants to respond to this, which is the distinction between so-called old Cold War and new Cold War. I'll tell you why I'm asking that, because even in so the way you framed it, Einar, was still a kind of binary, United States versus China. China trying to basically challenge the dominant structures. Absolutely true. But even during the first Cold War, the arguments were very similar. Soviet Union versus the United States. And you and I are old enough to remember that way back in the late 50s, the Sino-Soviet split had already taken place. China had a very different line on international affairs than what Moscow was proposing. India was a non-aligned country, was never into any of those, those camps. So if you think of that, makes 40% of the world's population was not in this bipolar, Soviet Union versus Washington argument. And in view of that, if you think of today's so-called new Cold War, do you think it's perhaps not entirely accurate to describe it as a conflict between China and the United States? What happens to, say, Russia? What happens to European Union? And there are, Iran, India, Brazil. There are other players who might have some, something more complex to contribute to the conversation. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you that it's not as simple as the first Cold War, and the first thing I point out is that Russia was never an economic threat to the United States, whereas obviously China is, or it's perceived to be. In terms of the first Cold War, it was very ideological. What we're talking about here is, and it was outwardly, I mean, both China and the USSR, having liberated their people, were very intent on bringing their revolution to the rest of the world. And of course, the rest of the world, headed by the US and Europe, were not interested in it. But lo, these many years, the sharp differences between socialism and communism, and then democracy and capitalism, have all but disappeared. There's no country that anyone can point to that says that it doesn't have a mixed economy. Socialist values are very much they're imbued in the United States, despite people saying, I don't like socialism. Well, you have welfare, you have pension programs, etc. You can't walk away from that. Whereas in China, they also, under Deng Xiaoping, they embraced capitalism. The issue today, though, is that whereas 40 years ago, U.S. was very pragmatic. It was all about less ideology. Yes, there were religious components, some parts. There was economic components to this. There was a desire to get countries to go along with U.S. Values about democracy, and especially in the economic realm when you start to talk about the World Bank and the IMF. But today, it's almost reversed. The U.S. is saying its ideology that American exceptionalism is justified by the need to, kind of follow this Francis Fukuyama and, last man standing in the end of history. That there's only really one method by which countries can prosper, and that is following this economic and political theory of democracy and capitalism. China has taken a hybrid approach. They didn't start out on some sort of ideological crusade, other than saying that they need a strong central government in order to govern China. That's historically accepted. And they believe that socialist principles should be the guiding hand of the government, and that capitalism was merely a vehicle of bringing people forward. So very, very different times now. It's not the same, but ideology plays a part. Now it's more on the U.S. side than I would say than on the Chinese side. And in terms of what you're saying about Russia, Europe, and things like this, yeah, they're there, but this backdrop is really being promulgated by the U.S., who feels threatened. So they've been lashing out. We have imposed unilateral sanctions, not only on China, but on Russia, on Europe, you name it. A friend and foe under Donald Trump did not exist. He was just, you were not American, and America was going to be first, and that was the end of it. I mean, the underlying premise is interesting. In the US, the feeling is that the US is a victim. Now, this is the most powerful economic, political, military entity in the world. And yet, Donald Trump was able to convince many people that somehow we are the victim, a victim of a world who has not given us our due. 5% of the world's population is entitled to consume over almost 20% of the world's GDP. So, there's this kind of a very skewed logic, and it's really a feeling within the U.S. Kind of pushed by 40 years of the middle class actually shrinking in terms of numbers, and their buying power, in essence, staying about the same.
So going back to the question of Western media versus non-Western media, this question is to Mr. Tanger. Based on your experience, what are the major differences in the mainstream Western and non-Western media in their coverage of international issues, Mr. Tanger, you would say? Is there any difference in how they see international issues? Because you have been a guest on multiple shows across the globe. Is there any difference at all?
Well, I would defer to my colleague and say that it's really about dominant media and other media. And in dominant media, you obviously get a very Western English, turn of thought. There is always what is good for the United States. It's talked about Europe, Canada, Japan, South Korea. The 185 other countries, unfortunately, are not necessarily as well represented. If you read the dominant media, you would think that the only things that are happening in the world are those affecting the first world countries, with a few bits and pieces about tragedies happening here, which reinforces this idea that the rest of the world is in complete chaos and the only saviors are the G7. So when you start talking about, the differences in media, it's really just about perspective. In the dominant media, it's really little acknowledgement that there can be any other view than that's perpetuated by democracy. It has to be a ballot box. and it has to be open free markets through capitalism. Unfortunately, it's, as I've always say on these things, we sort of live in a post-hypocritical world, because on one side, the ballot box is being violated in the very nation where it's being championed, and that is, through voter suppression. And obviously there was a tremendous amount of controversy over the last election that still continues. These are the types of things that if it was happening in another country, would be, exposed as, this is kind of banana republics, or this is the kind of things that happens in irresponsible little countries that don't know how to do anything. So there is a tremendous amount of ego involved, a lot of condensation, and this feeling that, your voices don't count. I do think that other nations, they do have a voice. I think most of them are frustrated. I know probably the vast majority of ambassadors here in Beijing I'm privileged that I'm able to talk to them fairly frankly in informal discussions, and it's very clear. They say, look, there's a big boombox that emanates out of the United States mostly, as the professor was alluding to earlier, and they dominate the discussion, much to the loss of everybody else. China has its own. It has state-run media operations, which are automatically seen as just propaganda. It's not applied to the BBC, which they say, well, no, that's fair and independent. But there's TRT, there's RT. I mean, you go across the world, and there are different types of media events. I mean, media groups, and those are largely discounted because they don't follow a kind of Western idea of what the media should be.
Right, but Professor Thussu, if I can ask this question to you as well. I mean, is there some sort of psychology associated with this question? Do you think that there would be a psychological acceptance of non-American media as Western media ever? I mean, I understand the argument that Mr. Tanger is making, that all the other media except the American, or probably the British to an extent, they think that the rest of the world is chaotic, and whatever they have to say out loud is probably probably should be accepted as a dominant narrative. But my question to you, Professor Thussu, is why is the non-American media or non-British media not accepted as global media? And do you think it is happening anytime soon at all, Professor Thussu?
Again, it's it's a non versus Western versus non-Western, broad categories. But even among the major countries, I mean, one of the privilege I had in the last few years was being associated with a project on media in the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Major countries representing different cultures, different geographical locations, different power equations. And this was a 4-year project based at a university in Finland. A Finnish colleague, actually, it was his project, but I was involved in it, and we produced 3 books based on that project, which was really looking at journalism in these countries. And what was astonishing was how little intra-BRICS media exchange takes place. So Brazilians have absolutely no idea almost of China. The Chinese know about India through what they have read in The Economist or seen on the BBC or read on the New York Times, and vice versa. Russians know nothing about South Korea and vice versa. So I think that was one of the most difficult bit to do in the project. How do you find common strands of these big countries with major, Russia, we sort of often in this binary of US versus China tend to ignore. It's a very powerful country. It has it's sitting on 10,000 nuclear weapons. It's an energy empire. It controls most of the fresh water in the world. So the next 20 years is going to be an extremely important country. But you talk to Russians, which I had the privilege to move to some, in my field, and their understanding of, say, India or Brazil is very limited, and it's often mediated through what they have read in or seen in Anglo-American media. So it really boils down to a structural problem. Now, part of the answer of that problem would be actually maybe the Western media or Anglo-American media do their job well. They are more professional, if you like, professional in inverted commas. They do. So, for example, me as a scholar of international communication, I read a lot from different parts of the world, and thankfully now they are available in English language. So I can get a sense of what the Turks are thinking, what the Russians are saying, what the Chinese are saying, etc., etc. When I was your age, I didn't have that privilege. So it was even bigger domination of basically Anglo-American media. Today, actually, there and I'm talking about internet, which we'll probably talk later. Even in the mainstream legacy media, there is extraordinary availability of context and framing of information from different parts of the world. For example, CGTN, every day I watch it because I need to know what the Chinese position on particular issues is as for my research interest. But the problem that in these 5 countries that I studied with some colleagues was the most striking point was the absence of that exchange. And it's not just a journalism problem, it's also an intellectual problem. It's an academic exchanges, cultural exchanges, I could go on. So I think that's the bigger problem. How do we address that? And it sort of is done sometimes through the like government initiatives. You have some exchange program, some journalists come attend a seminar and that's it. They produce a nice little book. But actually people to people interaction is extremely limited. And having spent a year in an elite university in China, and also I was actually in American college. It's a Schwarzman college, very elite college. So I was in the American bubble within the top university in China, and had the privilege to meet a lot of very interesting people. And not just in my field, people in policy and international relations. And you understand that, what they are understanding about the world is often mediated through certain sources. And exactly the same situation I felt in my own country, in India, when I talk to them about China, and their understanding is extremely limited of what they've read in a think tank in Australia or think tank in Germany or the US, etc. And I think that indigenous knowledge, exchange of ideas, and this kind of conversation that we are embarking on is actually a modest contribution towards that. That there is, need to create those horizontal exchanges that don't exist, or they're very weak at the moment.
True, and I totally agree with you. And even new academics like us, we make sweeping generalizations. We use the phrase global media when we are talking about only 2 countries, United States and Britain. We don't talk about any other country when it comes to.
It's mostly United States. Britain is the junior partner,
True, right. But another important question on media and communication, and then we will go to, we'll talk about US and the role of NATO and the role of, new organizations or global organizations and cooperation. But Mr. Tanger, one more question related to media and communication, because propaganda is something which is a huge topic that interests not only academics, but I think people across the globe who are consumer of news. They are either wary of what is happening, or they are more interested in which countries into propaganda and which countries not. And one of the countries that you have been defending very robustly on the Western media is China. And there's a lot of accusation about China on propaganda. But leaving that journalistic discussion aside, propaganda was a key element in the Cold War, if you can use the word old Cold War, Mr. Tanger. Do you think in this age of social media, and especially with artificial intelligence and the kind of power China has, digital capitalism, how do you see this role of propaganda, this new propaganda in this new Cold War?
Well, when you talk about propaganda, it doesn't exclusively belong to China. I mean, a lot of people would accuse the BBC of propaganda, RT. If you go to the US, CNN is seen by one side of, by the Republicans as propaganda, and the people who follow CNN see Fox News as propaganda. So, what you have here is an age of slanted journalism. Much of the kind of professional stuff that you would expected maybe a few years ago, it doesn't exist anymore. You're either on one side of the divide or another, and those who try to be in between are criticized by both sides. So when you say propaganda, you have to be a little bit more clear about it. From China's perspective, they view, as I said before, the way that the press works very differently. And when I'm trying to explain that to people, it's always taken as a defense. Actually, I would tell you that the Chinese are terrible at what they do. CNN is not taken seriously because they don't engage enough. They don't bring on people, other voices, people who will debate the issues very vociferously on the other side, and let people do that. But that's not something that the Chinese have historically done. They like to have some sort of consensus, agreement, civilized discussion. It's harder for them to do that, but they're going to have to. But frankly, they're a growing power. The idea that they can escape criticism from the world as their economic and political footprint grows is it's just not going to work. I mean, you can wish it, but it's not going to be true. Their PR game, terrible, especially vis-a-vis the dominant press, the dominant global press, if you like, that's out there. So they have tremendous issues. It's just that so often I'm put in a position where we're talking about one particular issue, and I'm not always impressed. I mean, as I said before, we live in an age of hypocrisy. The very countries that are saying that what China is doing is wrong. For instance, the U.S. has harped on China engages in subsidizing its industries. Well, I don't know, if you get down to Boeing and Airbus, both agreed to disagree. I mean, agreed that they both subsidize and things like that. There are tremendous subsidies within the U.S. For agriculture. They wanted to save their steel industry, not from China, but from the rest of the world. These things go on. But for some reason, if the United States does it, all right, it's okay. We can do that. If China started a war, for instance, that would be, just an example of a totalitarian state imposing its will on others. But if the U.S. starts a war in Afghanistan or Iraq or promotes civil unrest in Syria and other places, that's all in the interest of democracy, the greater good. American exceptionalism allows us to do this. So at this point, when you start talking about propaganda, the Chinese are reacting too often, I think. They have a great story. They don't get it out there enough. They're reacting too much to this kind of dominant press out there. And that has, that allows the Western press to dominate the discussion. And you can't get around it. Strategy is about not allowing the other person to dictate what's going on. And right now, strategically, China, Russia, many of the other countries out there who are struggling to find their voice don't get it. But then if they do say something that's anti-Western or anti-US, it's seen as propaganda.
I totally get that. I mean, you're basically in one sentence saying that Chinese strategy is to kind of find an opportunity to reply rather than being proactive and putting out their version. But in the new Cold War framework, propaganda, do you think is going to be a key element? And the countries, rather than saying one country, and Professor Thussu, please feel free to answer the question. Because of this amazing technological advancement that China has been able to achieve, especially 5G and going on, the country which is most likely to have an upper hand in having propaganda communication with all those technological advancements is China. What is the role of the new kind of propaganda in this age of technology you are seeing? Are we going to see more fierce battle? Professor Thussu, and then I'll come to Mr. Tanger as well. Professor Thussu?
It's interesting the way you framed the question, because China is a very important digital power. It has its own version of digital capitalism. It has the largest internet in the world. But that internet is largely Chinese. It's Mandarin speaking internet. The global internet is controlled by very, very few exclusively American companies. Some of the revenues are in $1 trillion. Um, people speak of surveillance capitalism today. There's a full-length book that a Harvard professor wrote a few years ago precisely on that topic. So that's, it's not just China which is threatening the privacy and, as we speak, there is a major scandal being reported all over the world, connected with an Israeli company which deals with privacy and sells this kind of technology to governments around the world. So I think it's not just a country specific problem. We are now getting into that age where we have become the commodity. We, you and me, individuals have become commodities, and therefore trading of our privacy, our time, our lifestyle, everything is part of a global system where China is a very important player, but not, I would say, as we speak now at this stage, as big as the Facebooks and the Googles of the world. But the contestation is happening. That's what Einar said at the very beginning. That is what is really driving this so-called new Cold War, because the Americans feel that a domain that they created very assiduously for last 30 years, 40 years even, and has very strong, links with security establishment, with the old Cold War and Pentagon and all that, is now being challenged by this supposedly upstart country. And I think that's why it's creating a lot of contestation, and that contestation will also take place in the realm of artificial intelligence, etc. As we move into 6G and 5G and all that. 5G is already here, 6G. So I think it's an interesting area for your generation of academics to study. I can only kind of see it from a distance.
A quick response, Mr. Tanger. Would you like to respond to this one?
No, I agree with the professor. It's really about this kind of dominant things. I mean, you can compare it a little bit to colonialization. I mean, this idea that Western powers, the advanced powers, have been feeding things to everybody else, and it's for their own good. This kind of paternalism has for a long time grated, I think, on a lot of countries. But you're not going to change that feeling if you go to Britain. I mean, my goodness, Boris Johnson is always, slipping gaffes over his, over his attitudes. You still see that in the U.S. There's still this feeling that white Western world is really the only thing that stands between, the end of the world and all of these other people are just kind of, they're there, but they need to be guided by the big white brother. Now, I mean, it is paternalistic. It's maybe a little bit too far, but it does express a lot of the feelings that I encounter through other countries and their representatives.
All right. So now from media and communication, we'll turn our attention to some alliances, some institutions, and their role in the new Cold War framework. So I would like to start by asking you, Mr. Tanger, about the role of Quad. What is your view on the need and effectiveness of Quad, and which links obviously US with Australia, Japan, and India against the so-called Chinese assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting issue. I mean, obviously, it's orchestrated by the United States. They want to put pressure on China, not, and this is kind of outside. I mean, these are all groups other than Japan who just, are really on the periphery. India does not have a direct stake in the South China Seas, but it's an opening. China has their, what was it originally, 11-dash line, then it became a 9-dash line, basically saying, hey, look, traditionally we did control that area. Now, if you go back over 2,000 years, yeah, they were. China was the undisputed heavyweight power, not only in the region, but of the entire world. There's little question that their navies controlled all these areas, that type of thing. So it wasn't really an issue there. It became an issue when the US decided that they wanted to extend their territorial jurisdiction to 200 miles. And this set off this series of negotiations, which ended in UNCLOS, UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea. Ironically, having started this process, the US said, no, we don't accept any power greater than our own. We will not allow we will never be subject. Our sovereignty will never be subject to anybody else. China joined, but before they joined, they passed a law saying, look, this area is ours, and this is our historic area. So they try to caveat it. And now you have this mess in the South China Seas. But keep in mind, it's not everybody versus China. All of these countries that are involved have at least four disputes with their neighbors, one with China and three with different neighbors. So it's not like things, it's a complete mess that was created by UNCLOS, and now they're trying to figure it out. And unfortunately, what it has become is pretty much of a land grab. If when Vietnam abrogated a treaty that it had with China and just jumped on some islands, there was this realization that if you don't control it, you don't have it. In the law, we always say possession is 9/10 of the law. So what you have is a grab. But I would fault China on this basis. They have not been creative enough. The issue here is, do you want the US and India and other nations who are not, and Australia, trying to put their foot into an area which is, contiguous to your country? It would be kind of funny. Let's say China went to Cuba and started trying to use it as a base and doing freedom of navigation tours through US waters and things like this. It would be a complete mess. So at this juncture, it would behoove China to do something that brings their neighbors together. They have the RCEP with ASEAN. That could be a springboard for bringing everyone together who is directly affected and said, listen, we have our differences. Let's solve them. For instance, if China were to say, look, this is an area that's shared by all of us. Let us come to a formula where we can not only have a joint jurisdiction over it, we can put away all of these disputes, and we can share in whatever is there and figure out a formula to do that. Well, this would be very interesting because it would, in essence, at that point, ASEAN would swing to the other side and say, hey, listen, India, US, Australia, please don't get involved. This is not your issue. The other argument that's always kind of looming in the background is that somehow China is going to shut down the South China Seas, and it's going to embargo everybody and restrain trade. Well, it's an interesting idea. 40% of China's trade, remember, they have to pull in tremendous resources from other countries, and they have to, in order to pay for them, they have to ship out value-added goods. 40% of that goes through South China Seas. 80% of their oil from around the world goes through the South China Seas. The idea that there'd be some sort of economic, political, or military advantage to shutting down things, it's like saying to somebody, why don't you cut off your artery to the main artery to your heart, and that'll show everybody. It's laughable in that extent. And I'm not saying this isn't a proponent, pro-China approach. They just physically couldn't do it. It would be impossible. They would be literally killing their own economy. So, you have things there, lack of creativity, and also, let us say, false premises being put into the equation by, quote, the dominant media.
Right. But Professor Thussu, the tangent talks about how China versus all is the narrative here, and how there are countries which think, okay, China is a danger to them. And he also talks about the position which I would, define or probably categorize it as a normative position, where he says, okay, these countries can go to each other and say, look, I'm not a threat to you, or you're not a threat to us. So therefore we should sort of all live happily together. But unfortunately, that is not how it is working on the ground. So for example, this whole idea of China, and that's why I asked you a question earlier about the propaganda and the role of propaganda in the new Cold War. For example, NATO very clearly says China is a security challenge. So when you categorize a country as a security challenge, and by that extension, a threat to your own existence, then it becomes very difficult to engage with them in any possible way. Professor Thussu, am I reading too much into it, or is it correct that China is seen as a security threat or security challenge by others, and therefore the alliances that we see in the region might not be as friendly as it should have been, as Mr. Tanger hopes for?
Well, it's the indication of changing geopolitics around the world. I mean, it's interesting that this idea of Indo-Pacific was originally coined by the Japanese officials. And it was one of those interesting phrases which didn't actually mean very much. But then Pentagon picked it up, and it became a New York Times picked it up, and Economist picked it up, and it became a standard phrase. And of course, now is part of the lexicon of international relations. And therefore, the media become very important, elite media, how they frame these things. So I think, but there is an issue here, which is it's not just about the shipping lanes, but there are also instances where China has actually constructed structures, and they have not just economic importance, but also military significance. And China has had problems with many countries, including in that region, historical problems, unresolved borders, etc., etc. So I think it is one of those geopolitical debates which are likely to continue, but also to take a very realistic view of it. If you think of, as Einar very wisely said, if China had a base near Cuba or Venezuela, and how will the American media react, or Western media more broadly react, or Western governments react? If you look at and this publicly available information, if you look at how many American bases are there in that area of East Asia, the point is very clearly made. Even after 70 years of ending of the Second World War, American forces are there in Japan and in South Korea and many other places across there. So I think it's a it's a kind of debate which will continue because it has geopolitical implications for both parties and for other players, including India, Australia, etc. So it sort of feeds into a kind of broader narrative of democracies versus authoritarianism, the consort of democracies. We've heard all of that in various historical contexts going back to the 19th century. But it's an interesting, debate, and we'll see how it unfolds. But again, how it is mediated is very important. As I said about Indo-Pacific, the phrase, how that became a kind of accepted phrase with, and the credit was not given to the Japanese. The Americans appropriated it.
A quick question, because we have to wrap it up. Professor Thussu, I'll come to you as well. A quick reply, Mr. Tanger. Do you think, therefore, China has a perception problem? For example, projects like Belt and Road Initiative, and as you said, initially China wanted to have Pakistan and India together in this project. But do you think China overall has a perception problem? A quick reply to that.
Is that to me or the professor?
Yes, Mr. Tanger, it's for you.
Okay. Yes, they do have a perception problem, and it goes back to what the professor said about the lack of knowledge between these countries. He was here, he saw the communication between just BRICS, and they actually have a formal organization. Their understanding of each other is very, very poor. I could attest that that's true in all of the stands and their neighbors as well. And it goes both ways. Very, very few people understand. So therefore, it is easy for a dominant press to exacerbate those differences and to dictate, or at least not dictate, to put out there a lot of verbiage saying that these are the evil people and you should believe us.
All right, and Professor Thussu, we have got 2 minutes left. So a quick reply from you, and then we'll go back to Mr. Tanger. Do you think China has the money, but also perception problem, and probably it's high time to have an Asian media house which is as good as any Western media organization? Professor Thussu, a quick one.
They have the money, they have the resources, but they still lack a kind of storytelling skills, narrative building. And I think part of the problem is the way the system is run. It is a state-managed system. So creativity is constrained by that system. And therefore, it will take time for it to kind of evolve at a level where it will be taken seriously outside China. And I mean, as somebody who's studying this for some time, I would say that there is enormous need for that, to provide a slightly different perspective on global affairs. But it has to be in a style and manner that works across cultures. At the moment, it doesn't.
Right. And last question, Mr. Tanger, how do you see this new Cold War unfolding in the next 5 years? Mr. Tanger. Final word.
Yeah, I don't think it goes well. I think there might be some reset if Biden is able to win the midterm elections and get enough votes where he can start seriously tackling his domestic agenda. The international agenda has been pretty much held hostage by what he needs to do internally. I can understand that completely. But unfortunately, it's causing rifts and problems that are going to be evident through the next 5 years. So I don't see a lot of hope, maybe some brief resets, but the competition between the US, who wants to suppress China, and China, who's determined to lead their own existence, is going to be a continuing factor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tanger, for joining us from Beijing, and thank you, Professor Thussu, for joining us from Egypt. That's all we have in this session of Global Ideas, brought to you by Hong Kong Baptist University. Please do not forget to share this video as much as possible. Please send us your suggestions or feedbacks or comments. And if you want us to invite somebody to be a part of our panel, we will give it a shot. Please do write to us. So that's all. We'll see you in the next episode of Global Ideas. Till then, stay safe. Goodbye.